All right, Kevin, I appreciate you making some time talking through some of this stuff with me. We can just jump right into questions here. So the first one that I had for you, I think I've looked at a lot of other GPs. I feel like everybody has a little bit of an orthogonal path in order to get to venture and become a fund manager. I'm just curious about your path. I guess for anybody that's not familiar with you at Rackhouse, could you give the quick elevator pitch on how you got to where you are today? And
Sure.
then maybe that'll lead me into some of the key lessons that you had at your time at Uber.
Yeah, man, absolutely. So yeah, I spent about 15 years as a data scientist, ML engineer, early stage data guy, as a builder, first in academia, then jumped into startups, was early on at Uber, was there for about 7 years, and then did about 4 or 5 more years in various sort of entrepreneurial flavored things, founding, joined a couple of other companies, helped a friend start a company, um, but decided to start a venture fund in 2020. And kind of came at this from the sort of idea that I think relatively uncontroversially, operators make the best early stage investors from a ability to kind of spot and connect with founders. Um, but like didn't have a background in coming out of business school, wasn't really in like a corp dev, biz dev type domain that feels like a lot more common for the sort of people who matriculate into venture. Was like just a full-on engineer data nerd. Decided to jump into the space. um I think in some sense, like I've always found like launching a fund, different is exciting, but also different is scary. So like depends on from an LP perspective, from like a partner perspective. So I've always tried to figure out when I was like raising the fund, is this good different or bad different? And obviously was able to close a $15 million fund with enough folks who kind of like the flavor of different I brought. And then we closed $45 million for our second fund here in late 2023. So we're well on our way, midway between Fund Two and Fund Three at this point.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I feel like when you talk to enough other LPs in the space, I feel like everybody has good things to say about you. I feel like your reputation is already preceding somebody that started like in 2020. It feels like you've been around longer than you have. Could you just talk about like so your time at Uber? I think
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, as somebody that didn't work a big tech job in my life, like some of the lessons that have translated from that experience into now evaluating much earlier stage businesses, like maybe some things that you've taken from that experience and apply in your role today.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I think about the way I work with founders, I always think about like great advice takes one of three flavors, which is either, here are things you are doing well that you should be doing like 100 times faster than you are, right? They're kind of like usually like reasoning things out from first principles. They're kind of, bushwalking, walking through the jungle. They needed to be just like sprinting, right? Um, or it's like, here are the few things that you are panicking about and spending way too much time and mental energy on that are completely irrelevant and you need to just like aggressively forget about them. And the third is like, what is the like one thing you're not thinking about that will kill your company if you're not giving it more attention? And like that mindset about like do the good things faster, like recognize your brain is tricky and like focuses on the wrong stuff. And then like every so often, you really do need to be panicking, all grew out of my operating experience. That like these were the three classes of things at Uber, at every company, that I felt like I was sort of typically bad at, and I felt like most of the team was bad at. Was like, like customers seem to be using our product like 20% month over month is good, right? And I remember like Bill and Shervin being like, Bill Gurley coming in and being like, look, guys, like I know you think that this is great, but you do not recognize like how special this is. You need to be like going even faster than you think you are going right now. Or I remember I spent like months and months and months stressing about over like what the press releases were about surge pricing. That was like one of my babies. My first big project at Uber was surge. And I think that there was sort of it was one of those situations where I had the right instincts, probably taking it way too far and way in the wrong direction, which is like, of course, you want people to love your product and you need to be paying attention to like complaints and critiques. But I remembered so much about like what we were doing at surge pricing was sort of tied to this sort of turbulent flow, stochastic flow model. I can go like super nerdy on it. But the net of it is that we were seeing like really compelling data that showed that more cars were available for more people more consistently in every market that we were surge pricing in. And I remember Travis being like, Novak, get off Twitter. Like, pay attention to the stuff that really matters, which is more people are getting rides home. They're coming back. They're kind of engaging with the system. Stop panicking, right? Um, and then I remember even like the sort of classic narrative around Uber was, um, I there's a lot of dimensions to it, but I remember this idea of like we were very comfortable kind of reinventing a lot of these processes, like the how we did performance reviews and kind of how we thought about automation and scaling and even dynamic pricing as a full stop was like a thing that a lot of people with I think well intentioned were saying, look, do not screw with this, like do not just like monkey with people's prices. And I always felt like the story of sort of Uber's 2017, the things that worked, the things that didn't, for the stuff that really blew up in our face, it was like, what is the like one thing we should not be reinventing from full stop, right? And for us, it like the takeaway, I was like, do not reinvent how a company does HR. Like, do not reinvent, how a company thinks about like its legal function. Like that was the one thing we weren't paying attention to. We were kind of comfortable freewheeling that ultimately ended up blowing up in everyone's face.
Yeah. No, I think it's smart. I mean, I think it also gives you a pretty unique vantage point to where the world is headed today. I mean, I think in the previous era, a lot of it was just static pricing,
Yeah.
whereas like today we've moved into a much more usage-based pricing world, and I think that trend is probably going to continue. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think this kind of ties into the next question that I had, which is around founder errors of the past versus founder errors in today's world. I'm just curious about your vantage point. Like maybe some stuff that you saw 5 to 10 years ago, things that could be nail in the coffin errors from a founder's perspective back then, and maybe how like those same risk have changed in today's world. Like maybe the things that are like hair on fire problems for founders in 2025 versus founders in 2015.
For sure. Well, I mean, you sent me these questions a little bit in advance. The first thing that jumped out to me was like the frequency and willingness to like re-architect the system. Like just jumps out to me. Like we're obviously spending a bunch of time in generative AI, and I remembered like the common wisdom, um, largely born out of like scar tissue that every like I felt this, and I had other folks who had this was like do not re-architect your system, right? Like resist that instinct. Like I always felt like there was this phase. I was like angel investing from 2015 to 2020, and like I always kind of had this little speech prep for CEOs, especially like non-technical CEOs, because I'm like, listen, your engineer is going to come to you and he's going to say, or she is going to say, like, we can't possibly keep adding tech to the system. You got to give me like 3 months to like rebuild my system from scratch, right? And I always said this shtick with the founders around like, do not listen to that. Like, listen to your co-founder, except in this circumstance, because like a perfectly architected system that doesn't have product market fit and the cycles you spend on that are just ultimately you're going to be cycles that eat into the timeline you have to get to product market fit, right? Like, just now is the time to like take on technical debt and focus on that. And I feel like there is still a certain amount of like wisdom in that sense around like your job when you start a company is to take your investors' money and like validate the hypothesis, and ideally in the form of bountiful revenue as far as finding product market fit, and then we can worry about tech debt, right? The big challenge you have now in the sort of world of especially generative AI, if you're building in or around that space, is just the underlying infrastructure is evolving so freaking rapidly, right? That the companies that we see in the Rackhouse portfolio where they kind of fall in love with their specific architecture, whether it's for, I mean, I put that in kind of very like self-centered sort of ego-driven reasons, but also just that idea of like, um, let's lock it in so we have one less thing to worry about. As soon as you stop being willing to throw your architecture out and kind of evolve with like whatever the latest and greatest tech is, you start creating gaps for companies to come in and kind of take your customer and take your product market fit. And so the best companies are now like just even very willing to like re-architect basically on the fly, right? I think a good example of this is like last year the whole system was about like you got to have a vector database and embeddings and re-ranking. And for any of you who don't know what that is, um, you can kind of ignore everything I've just said, but the whole point being like that was the very trendy architecture 12 to 18 months ago. And you just spend all of your engineering cycles on that. And the vast majority of the stuff is basically available via an API call at this point, or certainly an open source project that you can just sort of download with like 3 lines. And so, like, God, if you are still building this or thinking that's your secret sauce, like you got left behind three open AI press releases ago, kind of thing is the way I think about it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, how do you think that engineering resources in general have been reallocated over the last couple of years with like the rate of pace or the rate of innovation change that we're seeing, where like companies are kind of forced to be a little bit more proactive in terms of just
Mm-hmm.
like thinking ahead, planning for the future. I'm just curious how you're thinking, like how you're seeing engineering departments reallocate some of their labor.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think largely driven by this sort of land grab, sort of technology rush we're in generative AI. Like the departments I'm seeing are definitely valuing the sort of generalist skill set over the specialist skill set. And what I mean by this is kind of like I always even think about this when I was like building my organization at Uber. Like as you hit a sort of scale up, I always thought of it as like you have two different flavors of hard. One type of hard is like I want to be the engineer, the data scientist, the PM who finds like 2% more revenue or usage out of like a mature scaled up product, right? There is somebody who comes into work every day who's like, how do I make Gmail like 1% better, right? And that's insanely difficult if you think about like the reach of like a product like Gmail and the maturity of it. The other type of hard is the generalist type of hard, which is no one task even needs like a master's degree in computer science. But what makes it hard is you got to do like 85 of those tasks in parallel while keeping your sanity and ideally sleeping at least 6 or 7 hours a night. And the difficulty is in the like heterogeneity of your workflow. I think that kind of hard is all over the place right now. That kind of latter sort of generalist hard, where a lot, especially as this infrastructure is becoming more transposable, you need to find these engineers who are sort of capable of doing a pretty broad basket of tasks spanning front end, back end, engine like AI engineering, API, prompt engineering. And you maybe don't have to be like the best person in the industry in any one of those, but you got to be kind of B plus, A minus in all of them. That's a different skill set. And but I think it just reflects the sort of very dynamic nature of innovation right now. Eventually, like we'll kind of hit a point of diminishing returns, things will coalesce, and you got to find that like one engineer who can build you a real-time serving infrastructure that's just like one of one. That's just not where we're at in history right now.
Yep, I think it makes sense. I mean, I think it's a topic I've asked a lot of other friends about, of just like some of the second order effects as AI becomes more and more advanced and a part of all the organizations that we work in.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think I'll that's the next question I had for you, like some of the second order effects of intelligence becoming cheaper. I mean, I think I'll start it off just in terms of my vantage point. So we have, I mean, I don't know how many GPs I talk to on an annual basis, but it's probably a few hundred at this point. And I've talked to, I don't know, at least 70 to 80 so far in 2025. And I think the topic of hiring junior talent has come up in a lot of those calls. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of these GPs, they're just having a hard time rationalizing hiring a new analyst associate for even like sub $100,000 a year, just because the
Yeah.
cost of intelligence now and what a lot of those junior VC roles, what they would be doing, now costs $20 a month, $30 a month, and is being trained and improved just on the GP server. And so I'm curious. I mean, that's just like one very specific instance of some knowledge becoming commoditized. But I'm curious from your vantage point, like how you're thinking about second order effects of
Sure.
of that.
Yeah. So the thing I would say is I think we're like in the incredibly early innings of all this stuff in AI. And I think that some of these decisions around like do I bring on an analyst or a junior hire, or do I like put a fraction of that salary, that money I'd earmarked for his or her salary against an AI product, is very rational in the sense that like signing up for a ChatGPT Pro subscription is like 3 clicks on the Stripe flow, and like hiring an analyst is, I mean, in addition to being both more expensive, is like a significantly larger time investment. I have to go launch a hiring process and like find him or her. But I think if like the way I think about all of this is if you zoom out and think about this as like this is a 10 or 20-year cycle. And I think this mindset of like replace the humans with AI is a very right now problem. I actually think that this equilibrates pretty soon in the sense of um the sort of current state of competition, right, between firms, whether it's VC or otherwise, is sort of reflecting this idea of the level of competition is here, and is relatively fixed, and like as soon as if I can like maintain my competitiveness, kind of maintain my stack rank, my position on the Midas list or whatever, but for cheaper, like that's great, right? That's more money in my pocket, that's more money for my bonus, that's more money for this other project I want to do. I think like what history says is just the level of competition is going to go up. Eventually somebody's going to be like, hey, sure, I can have an analyst or associate or an AI, but what happens if I have an analyst plus an AI, right?
Mhm.
Like, do I win more deals? I'm not necessarily saying that's true, but I do think a lot of these sort of human versus AI discussions are kind of very short term, right? Like the Klarna made a ton of headlines about how they like laid off 30% of their customer support staff or whatever the number was, pretty meaningful, and replaced it with AI. And everybody was like, "Is this the end of customer support?" And they were very proud about being able to maintain their customer support metrics with this now like 70% of the humans plus AI. And my counter argument was like, when was the last time you've ever like had an interaction with any customer support in the last 3 months as a user? And you were like, wow, that was amazing. That was it. We've like peaked as a human race. Like customer support gets no better. I still think like we're like hitting parity with a pretty disappointing sort of mediocre process. And I think the best companies are going to figure out what comes after, like whatever Klarna is doing, is some idea of like, what if we deliver fundamentally higher competitive pressure, right? What if we deliver fundamentally better customer support? And I think to do that, you got to have humans involved.
Yeah. I find myself agreeing with that more. I mean, you think about there's really four main forms of leverage, and labor is one of them. And I think there's like this idea that some firms have where you can just scale up, build massive amounts of leverage via code, media, or capital and just exclude labor. Like I think labor is, I mean, if you can have trained labor that can give you additional leverage by being trained with the usage of AI, and they can have that to become a little bit more competent in their roles, or they can like train a team below them to take more and more off the top of the organization's plate. That's a net positive. I mean, I think there's also parallels to like you think about a lot of the people that I was competing against when I was breaking into venture 6, 7 years ago. I mean, everything they put on their resume is like my skills are in Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel.
Sure.
And you realize there's a like sure, there are skills within using those applications, but I think being able to be competent in the use of like Airtable, Zapier, Figma, like other more modern tools gave me a leg up on people like that. I think the same thing will apply for people that are very competent in like Cursor, Replit, or other AI first products where they can use that
Totally.
as a differentiator. Um, so I don't know.
I think that's right. I mean, I think you're seeing sort of a skills rotation But then I also think that what will come with that is like, oh yeah, of course, like you can triage like all of our firm's investor updates that come in. Like we can have one person doing that through some sort of insane like cursor, Zapier pipeline. But I also expect you to go and cover like the following sort of demo days and all the other
Yep.
things that like we need human beings to handle. I just think the expectations of all of us collectively as professionals in VC, but also in general, probably go up. And if you're not thinking about that, you probably are about to get lapped by some firm that is thinking about that. Because I tell you, like, I mean, I spend 3 to 4 hours a day writing code for Rackhouse through an AI accelerated pipeline, right? Like
Yeah.
the only reason I can do that and keep my sanity is through AI.
Yeah. 100%. Um, how do you think about new business models created from AI first businesses?
Well, great question. I honestly, I believe that these are almost sort of by definition unpredictable, right? Like my mindset in this is sort of saying, instead of trying to spearfish and figure out what the models are that works, we want to be really good hunters and just sort of like, look, let's get a lot of coverage, right? Like all the time we save, we're like, we don't have to like spend days writing our LP updates. They're about takes us about 15 minutes. Like that, 3 days, 23 hours, and 45 minutes that we get back goes into coverage. And then the other component of this is just getting like stood up from nothing to competent really, really quick. So my perspective is, instead of trying to thesis generate, just be really, really reactive and good at reacting. Kind of, I mean, it reflects a lot of how I think about Uber, right? Like if you had thought, okay, we want to use this whole like mobile device internet era to figure out the dominant business model for transportation in the context of these technologies, you'd end up with like a firm like Cabulous or Taxi Magic. You remember these? Where it was like, look, let's take the best form of like on-demand urban modality pre all of this tech, which was taxis, and then just like layer the technology into it. Right? It's kind of a the best thing from the sort of pre-era layered with current era tech. I think in the enterprise space, you kind of think about like if I wanted to move data centers into the cloud, and I was sort of early, you kind of build Cloudera, right? It's sort of like take all of the on-prem mindset of like Hadoop and HBase and HDFS, but then leverage cloud tech. And if you wait, if you kind of figure out what the like cloud native version of this is, you get Snowflake, which from an investor perspective is basically a 10x outcome on the terms of ROI. But the idea of like what that would look like when you were 1 or 2 years into cloud, like I'm not smart enough to figure it out. You think about Taxi Magic versus Uber, and if everybody always joked about this, that like your mother used to say like don't get in random people's cars from the people that you met on the internet, but like that was sort of that's the Uber business model, right? So I'm gonna conspicuously say not just I don't know, but I don't think it's knowable. And I think you just got to react really agilely.
That was I mean that's a good segue to my next question, but I think you already answered it. And that was going to be, how do you think about investment time horizons, especially today when things are changing as quickly as they are?
Yeah.
Because I think in terms of, I mean, you think about a lot of the work of the previous era's funds, like so much work went into mapping out a thesis, and then you kind of just like, I don't know, you make bets based on your projection of where the world is going 10 years from now. I think over the last year or two, we've just kind of seen, and even farther back than that, like the last 4 to 5 years, like if you would have rewinded the clock to 2021 and shown somebody some of the products that we use today, they wouldn't believe it.
Right.
And so I think it's just, I mean, I've talked with other GPs about this too, of just like how it's become a lot harder to actually make informed guesses on where the world is going to be in 10 years.
Yeah. I
I
mean,
don't
like
know.
I think that that's true. I think it. But I also think that this has a lot of historic parallels to me, right? Like I think that this is just symptomatic of us being real cycle. Where if you look back at like one of the things I was doing when I was starting Rackhouse is I was trying to kind of crib from like the firms I thought had launched really, really well. And like what did they look like early on? And if you go to like Andreessen Horowitz's first deck, like their first thesis was like, we invest in like software that lives on the internet, right? Like that was like the whole thesis, right?
Yeah.
And that is like nowadays that represents something like on the order of hundreds of venture funds are all investing in a subset of that thesis, right? Or you go back to like, the benchmark in these firms that got started in the 90s and they were investing in like computer networks. Like we invest any technology which gets value out of like connecting one piece of technology to another piece of technology over a telephone wire was sort of like the thesis, right? And so I think the best firms that do really well in the beginnings of these cycles start with this very like wide open horizontal thesis, right? Like Rackhouse very intentionally was like, we invest in companies that leverage data, AI, or ML for their core value proposition in any industry and almost any geography, right? Like I'm very aware how big the box I just articulated is, but I think that that's the way that you can most effectively harness the returns that come. And then over time, I mean, you look at a firm like Andreessen, I think is a good example of how these theses evolve. They've done it kind of through a kind of fractal, reorganization within the firm to say, all right, well, once you start with like software on the internet, you go consumer, enterprise, right? And it kind of coalesces into a bunch of sort of distinct theses. But like early on, draw a big box. Know a lot of companies are going to come into it and build a firm that's ready to respond to that.
Yep. I think that's the right approach. I feel like that's also why it's just really hard to back really broad generalists and a fun one right now.
For sure.
Unless you just have like your ridiculous spin out or you're coming from Sequoia, like
Yeah.
sure there are exceptions to that rule, but I think in general, like LPs aren't really interested in backing somebody with broad level knowledge. They want somebody with very deep domain level
Yeah,
expertise.
I mean, I
Um,
think I think it's an exercise in like which axes of your thesis do you allow to be generic? Like for us, like industry is is sort of very generic, but you need to have a strong point of view on some other axis of your thesis, right? Like for
yeah.
us, we're very sort of tech and sort of technology domain specific, and then we're very specific in like how we want to win, which for us is very, like we want to kind of connect operator to operator with founders. We want to build a team and a network of people who kind of conduct themselves in a certain way that founders are going to recognize. So you've got like we're very opinionated in the way we win and support companies. We're very opinionated on tech, and we're very unopinionated on basically every other axis, kind of by design.
Yep. Totally agree. You had a piece that you put out recently on why you think infrastructure will matter more than algorithms. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, I think for one, if you just look at the research pipeline, like you look at what people are doing, like I don't think the story stops with transformers. I don't think it stops with chain of thought. I think that these are all huge step ups, big rungs on the ladder of continuing, of us kind of continuing on this march towards, increasing machine intelligence, increasing computer intelligence. But I also think if you zoom out, the ladder goes all the way back to like deep learning and logistic regression and this is a staircase, a ladder, pick your favorite metaphor we're on, of algorithms. But I actually think like the trends which are unlocking this cycle, um one, well, I think are have a huge infrastructure domain, right? Like there was a time I remember, like I'm a nuclear physicist by training. Everybody says like, oh, like why'd you pick this domain, which is kind of actually was at the time kind of passe, kind of out of favor even within the physics community, because it was really a domain which had its heyday in the Cold War, right? When we were building bombs and all of that. And I picked it because they had the most supercomputer time, right? That was literally like they needed programmers and they had a lot of time on what was then the most effective way to solve numeric math problems, right? And so I was like, great, supercomputers is the future of all this. Like your typical routine run-of-the-mill data scientist these days has effectively, especially for the like dollar cost, access to orders of magnitude more compute than I ever did as a supercomputer specialist, just by like I have an AWS bill, I have a Lambda bill, right? So I think like the ability to bring cloud compute, cloud storage, cloud data processing online and democratize the price to the point that any routine data scientist has access to this has been a huge contributing factor. It gives you the kind of substrate upon which you can build, you can put your algorithms in. And then the other component of this is you need the data itself to process, right? Like the amount of information which machines can now process, not just like text on the internet, but you think like the whole IoT, Internet of Things craze, the whole like all the work we're doing on sort of sensor and perception and computer vision. From my very biased perspective, that's just like an additional modalities which are being brought online where all of a sudden a system like Uber, which was like at the time spending an elaborate amount of time trying to string together people's like consumer grade cell phones to try to create like a sensor net of a city to model a traffic network, like that's pretty commoditized tech. Like the idea that anybody with an app store subscription can now get like a live snapshot of basically traffic flow through New York City is kind of mind-boggling from an analytics perspective, but like that's the infrastructure trends we're benefiting from.
Yeah. No, it is crazy to think about. All right, I got two more questions for
Yeah,
you.
bring it on.
What's the worst part about venture that nobody talks about?
Oh, um, this is probably going to get me in trouble with your readers, but I candidly think the worst part of venture is other VCs, in the sense of like I think one of the things that I was so appreciative of when I was building was like it's such a mission driven organization that like you were all about recruiting and like engaging on your team was like finding and attracting people who were like down for the cause, building like whatever the mission you were on for the same reasons. And I think venture, which isn't to say all VCs are like this, but there is such a different mindset in terms of like you find people who are kind of your people, but there's lots of people for whom I was joking with somebody about this the other day. It's like if we weren't like work friends or work connections, like we would never hang out, right? Like that's pretty, and that's not only is that true, but that's like kind of normal, right? Like that's kind of just part of the job. Like I always think of venture as a calling. I recognize how cliche that is to say it, but like there's a reason I'm not sitting on a beach somewhere turning Uber returns into my ties with like I really do see this as a great and important way to spend 10, 20 years of my life. And I think that leads me to kind of look at problems differently and look at my connections differently, but that's part of it for sure.
Yeah, I think I have a pretty similar takeaway from venture. I mean, I feel like it is pretty transactional. It's also pretty isolating.
Yeah.
Whereas like, I mean, you're meeting with all these people all the time, but you have to say no 99% of the time, and like saying no to
Mm-hmm.
people that often, like it's not the best feeling in the world.
For sure.
But I do think, I mean, there's checks and balances where I think the bad actors get sniffed out
Yeah,
relatively easily, especially in today's world where it's like if you just have, I don't know, if you don't conduct yourself in the right manner and you treat founders poorly, you treat GPs poorly or LPs like that, like, it's a small world. I feel like it's one big game of telephone. Like reputation will
totally.
either help or hurt your career. So I
And
don't
I,
know.
I think I definitely think there's a challenge. Well, I agree with everything you just said as far as saying, look, a certain amount of this is just objectively poor behavior. But then the other thing, which is I think is true, is like there is not any one way to like win at VC, right? Like different people
Yeah.
have like reasonably intelligent people have very different theses, have very different hypotheses on like the best behavior in order to or the best sort of style like of we have to own 30% of this company or else like our model requires it, and other people are like if I own 1% of 100 companies I think I'm going to win. So I think it's not always just like shitty behavior. That's undoubtedly part of it. But sometimes, and that, which in some ways is worse because if the problem was just bad behavior, like the fix is kind of obvious.
Yep.
But I don't like the sort of structural forces which at play, which sometimes lead to this sort of transactional or unaligned behavior.
Yeah. I think, yeah, ideally you want to find people that are just playing infinite games. I think to
Right.
steal a line from
Or
Graham.
I really think it's true of everybody. Is like the thing that I took away was it's like when you find someone who is like capital we capital Y capital P like your people like hold them close, build your community, find them and don't let them get away.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like unfortunately that just takes a lot of calls, but
Exactly.
What we're fighting for. All right, last question I got for you. Who's another GP who's impressed you since starting Rackhouse?
Oh, um, I gotta say, like I am in general pretty self-content with like how well how well Rackhouse is done, what we're good at, what we're not good at. And I don't generally get envious of other GPs all that often. Well, I gotta say, Nicole Wishoff, like Wishoff Ventures, I am just so jealous of her ability to engage in social media, to build an audience. And I'm like, oh, cool. Well, like you're good at social media. And then she like gets into companies and like wins on companies that I am also I'm like, damn it, and you're a good investor. It's sort of one of those where like I just like I am consistently impressed by her ability to execute, especially as like another small like sort of solo GP fund that kind of started around the same time. So I gotta say, I'm a fan
I feel like she's a force of nature. Force of nature. I can't talk right now. You're the second GP to mention her name. I think the last time that I talked to Nicole, she's like 3 months pregnant, and she like told me at whatever event we were at that she was going to close out her fundraise. That she hadn't even started yet before she had the baby, and she did it
totally.
6 months at a time when it was really not easy to fundraise. And she was
Yeah,
just
exactly.
on the
It's
calendar.
like it's like she
LP
deploys
calls.
like an animal, like she's building a firm, which is sort of, as I said, makes me jealous. And I'm like, oh, but like, are you happy? And it's like, oh, and then you got the great kid, and you're happy in life. Like,
Yeah,
damn it, like the complete package.
she's killing it. Yeah, she's great. I feel like she's really building an institution. I think she's on what, Fund 3 now?
I think so.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I feel like that was relatively recent news. Everybody loves her. So shout out Nicole if you're listening. Um, all right, Kevin, I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but it's been great, man. I
for
really
sure.
appreciate it. I got a ton out of this. Hopefully everybody listening did as well. Just wanted to say thank you again.
Of course, happy to do it. Happy to contribute, and good luck. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, man. I'll let you go. I'll hit pause here.